So I read in your background that you have a bachelor's in neuroscience. That's a first. Did you think that you were going into like a science field prior to being a lawyer, and how do you feel it has affected or given you a different perspective?
So I certainly took a very large detour in my educational background. I'll put it that way, as I generally do when people ask me this. I think the degree itself is somewhat unusual.
Mm-hmm.
So I do tend to get comments because people will say to me, how on earth did you get that? And then why on earth did you end up here? Didn't you want to be a doctor? Yeah, I did want to be a doctor. I actually wanted to be a neurosurgeon, which is why I had the degree. And that specific degree is something I went after because not only did I want to be a neurosurgeon at the end of the day, but that degree from the university I attended, University of Minnesota, allowed me to do research as an undergraduate student. So believe it or not, I actually worked in a lab. I worked in a neuroendocrinology lab. I even wrote a thesis. I had my own lab grant, and I assisted several postdoc students on neuroendocrinology papers. So it was an amazing, amazing experience. But I took a very sharp turn from that to end up in law school and practicing family law. Very long story short, I had always wanted to be a neurosurgeon, and one day while working in the lab, the person I worked for noticed and pointed out that I have a latent hand tremor in one of my hands, and it happens to be my dominant hand. So it was one of those moments where I sort of had to recalibrate my life goals, so to speak, because it was pretty apparent that if I wasn't allowed to handle a scalpel in the lab without care, then I probably wouldn't be doing that in an operating room. So I happened to fall in league with a postdoc student who worked in the lab who had just received a patent for a gene they identified. I don't even know if you can do that anymore, but at the time you could. And I was really interested in the idea of patents. So I decided to go to law school to use my science background and pursue this intellectual property certification, which I did. I was lucky enough to go to a law school, Seton Hall, that has that certification. So I obtained that. I did work in patents and trademark throughout law school. And then when I went to clerk for a judge, the judge I clerked for, a month before the start of my clerkship, called me to let me know that he was transferred back to the family division. So I went sort of from neuroscience and neurosurgery to intellectual property to all of a sudden working in family law, which admittedly I had avoided in law school. But I ended up in family, and I fell in love with it because I admit that I really misjudged it out of the gate. Family law is such an unusual practice. The law is difficult at times, at other times it's not. It's the people. There's an enormous psychological and emotional component to it. And I enjoy working with people. And often I view family law as a puzzle. Sometimes you have to work through the emotional hardships and the burdens that people are going through to help them figure out what they need and want before they even know they do. And I will say, I do think at the end of the day, my background actually helps a lot in that department from the standpoint that science, particularly neuroscience, but I think science generally, requires you to be analytical. It's a very linear way of thinking. It's somewhat clinical. And I think in terms of family law that it has allowed me to look at issues and try and approach them in a very linear way. Now that doesn't work for every case, but I think for some clients, my ability to break things down into a stepwise function and walk them through from A to B is of significant assistance.